In Renaissance Florence, the Medici did not fall to swords or armies, but to poisoned wine, an invisible weapon that seeped into their veins and slowly destroyed one of history's most powerful dynasties. The story of the Medici begins in the heart of Florence, during the 15th century, when a family of bankers turned themselves into kings without crowns. Their fortune was not born of conquest, but of calculation, coin by coin, loan by loan, until their name became synonymous with power. The Medici Bank, stretching across Europe, supplied monarchs and popes alike. Money opened every gate, and through those gates the family walked into the corridors of influence. Yet their true legacy was not in ledgers, but in art. Florence bloomed under their patronage. Cosimo de' Medici, often called Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland, invested his wealth not only in politics but in the vision of artists and architects. Brunelleschi's dome, crowning Santa Maria del Fiore, rose like a declaration of Florentine genius, financed by Medici gold. Botticelli's brush, Leonardo da Vinci's sketches, Michelangelo's chisel, each found opportunity because a Medici hand opened the purse. But brilliance carried a price. For every chapel adorned with frescoes, there was a rival eyeing the Medici with envy. Florence was not merely a city of culture. It was a cauldron of ambition, where merchants, nobles, and factions competed for dominance. The Republic's fragile balance often cracked beneath the weight of intrigue. To many Florentines, the Medici were both benefactors and tyrants, weaving art and oppression into one gilded tapestry. Their rise from merchants to rulers was unprecedented, and it shattered old norms. Banking dynasties were meant to count coins, not command armies or dictate papal elections. Yet by the end of the 15th century, the Medici had produced not only dukes but popes Leo X and Clement VII, men whose decrees reached across Christendom. Florence, once a republic, now bent beneath their influence, cloaked in the language of civic liberty but pulsing with Medici control. In this glittering dawn of their power, the family seemed untouchable. Palaces lined with frescoes reflected their wealth. Alliances through marriage bound them to European thrones, and their portraits appeared in the very paintings they sponsored, eternal, triumphant. The Medici embodied the Renaissance itself, rich, ambitious, radiant with beauty. And yet, even in this golden age, shadows gathered. For in Florence, brilliance and betrayal were never far apart. The Medici were never content to remain bankers alone. They aspired to embody every possible face of power. By the 16th century, the family name stretched far beyond Florence. They sat on thrones, crowned as Grand Dukes of Tuscany. They wore the triple tiara of the papacy, commanding the spiritual destiny of millions. They were queens of France, marrying into Valois blood and shaping the course of European courts. This expansion made the Medici seem invincible. From Florence to Rome, from Paris to Madrid, their network resembled a spider's web woven across the continent. But power, once visible, attracts enemies, and the Medici, more than most, drew both admiration and resentment. Italy itself was fractured, a patchwork of republics, duchies, kingdoms, and papal states. Foreign armies, from Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, marched across the peninsula, each seeking dominance. In such chaos, daggers and armies were blunt tools. Poison, however, was silent, discreet, and nearly impossible to trace. In courts where a misplaced word could end a career, a tainted chalice could erase a life without public scandal. To the Medici, every banquet was a battlefield. The glitter of silver goblets and crystal glasses concealed invisible threats. Guests raised toasts, smiling across tables, never certain if the next swallow would be their last. Enemies lurked not only in rival families but within their own bloodlines. Brothers envied brothers, cousins plotted against cousins. The Medici, bound together by ambition, were also fractured by it. This paranoia seeped into their governance. Every decision, every alliance, was weighed against the possibility of betrayal. Letters from ambassadors whispered of plots, rumors of poisoners for hire, tales of physicians loyal not to their patients but to gold. In Florence's palaces, loyalty was never certain, and even marriage intended to seal alliances could become a trap where brides carried not dowries but death. For a dynasty that sought permanence, this was the irony. The higher they rose, the more fragile they became. To be a Medici meant wearing velvet robes and jeweled crowns, but also living with the knowledge that danger could be poured into your wine by the very hand that served you dinner. And so, even as the Medici filled Europe with art and splendor, they lived in a perpetual storm of suspicion, a family too powerful to ignore and too vulnerable to trust. The Medici dynasty's dance with poison and betrayal found one of its earliest turning points in 1537. Alessandro de' Medici, the first Duke of Florence, embodied both the promise and the peril of his house. Illegitimate by birth, rumored to be the son of Lorenzo II de' Medici and a servant woman of African descent, he nonetheless rose to power as the family's chosen figurehead. His rule was brief, marked by attempts to consolidate Florence under a single ducal authority rather than a republican facade. But Alessandro's reign also exposed the fissures within the family itself. His cousin, Lorenzino de' Medici, once trusted as a companion, grew envious and restless. On a January night in 1537, Lorenzino lured the Duke into his chambers under the guise of a private meeting. What followed was not the clang of steel in open combat, but the silent intimacy of betrayal. Alessandro was murdered not by a foreign enemy, but by his own blood. This assassination was more than a political act. It set a grim precedent. The Medici were no longer undone merely by external rivals. From that night forward, whispers of betrayal and the specter of poison haunted every chamber of their palaces. The lesson was brutal. One's greatest threat could wear the same family crest. The killing of Alessandro fractured Florence. His body lay lifeless, but his death breathed life into a tradition of suspicion. Lorenzino fled the city, celebrated by some as a liberator, condemned by others as a Judas. The Medici name, once associated with patronage and stability, was now entangled with treachery. This moment crystallized the sense of a curse. Florence had seen republics fall and tyrants rise, but a dynasty eating itself alive struck more deeply. From then on, any Medici death, especially those marked by strange fevers, sudden collapses, or inexplicable symptoms, was interpreted through the lens of poison and betrayal. Alessandro's blood on the floor of his cousin's chamber was only the beginning of a narrative that would shadow the family for centuries. The dynasty survived Alessandro's death, but it never escaped the paranoia it unleashed. Every toast, every banquet, every alliance now carried the question, whose hand holds the poison? By the late 16th century, the Medici court had transformed into a stage where mystery and mortality performed side by side. The reign of Cosimo I had elevated the family from dukes to Grand Dukes of Tuscany, solidifying their position among Europe's ruling elite. Yet prosperity in public life did not shield them from tragedy within their private halls. The most infamous episode unfolded in 1587 at the Villa di Poggio, a Caiano. Francesco I de' Medici, son of Cosimo I, and his second wife, Bianca Capello, both fell ill within days of each other. They had attended a banquet, shared meals, laughed under candlelight. Soon after, violent fevers gripped them both. Francesco died first. Bianca followed the next day. Official reports spoke of malaria, a common affliction in Tuscany's marshlands. But suspicions ran deeper. Rumors spread that Francesco's brother, Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici, orchestrated their deaths. Ambition, not disease, was the suspected culprit. Ferdinando, after all, renounced his cardinal's robes soon after and assumed the title of Grand Duke. To the Florentines, this sequence of events was too convenient, too perfectly timed. Poison, not pestilence, seemed the more plausible explanation. Historians for centuries debated the truth. Was it malaria, striking cruelly and coincidentally? Or was it arsenic, a powder that left few traces in its victims, delivered discreetly in food or drink? The whispers never ceased, and with each retelling the Medici reputation as masters and victims of poison deepened. The tragedy of Francesco and Bianca was more than a domestic scandal. It symbolized the corrosion of trust at the heart of the dynasty. A family that had built Florence into a jewel of the Renaissance could not secure safety at its own dinner tables. Public splendor hid private vulnerability, and the same halls where Botticelli once painted became theaters of suspicion. Modern science has since uncovered startling evidence. Traces of mercury and arsenic in their remains. Whether these were poisons or misguided medical treatments, they confirmed one thing: death in the Medici household was rarely natural and often shadowed by human intervention. The fall of Francesco and Bianca reinforced the legend that the Medici were cursed, not merely by fate, but by their own relentless pursuit of power. And as the dynasty pushed forward, every future death would echo with their story of banquet halls turned into tombs and laughter silenced by a sip of wine. The women of the Medici dynasty often carried fates as tragic as their husbands and brothers, and none illustrate this more than Eleonora de Toledo, the Spanish-born wife of Cosimo I. Known for her beauty, elegance, and formidable political influence, Eleonora was far more than a mere consort. She managed estates, secured alliances, and bore 11 children, strengthening the dynasty's hold over Tuscany. Yet beneath her silks and jewels, Eleonora lived under the same shadow of suspicion that haunted every Medici. In 1562, she and 2 of her sons died suddenly while traveling through Pisa. Official reports attributed their deaths to malaria, a plausible explanation given the marshy terrain of Tuscany at the time. Still, the circumstances raised eyebrows. How could a woman of such robust constitution, surrounded by physicians and attendants, succumb so swiftly? Private correspondence between ambassadors whispered another possibility: poison. Letters suggested symptoms inconsistent with malaria, describing rapid deterioration and signs that hinted at chemical interference. Some speculated that Eleonora's death was orchestrated by political rivals who sought to weaken Cosimo's grip on Tuscany by striking at his most trusted partner. Others believed her demise served internal ambitions, clearing succession pathways in a family already fractured by intrigue. Regardless of the cause, her death left Florence reeling. Eleonora had been beloved by many for her devotion to her children and her careful management of courtly life. Her funeral was lavish, but grief was tinged with unease. Was she a victim of disease, or another casualty of Florence's endless appetite for power? The fate of Medici, women like Eleonora, became part of a broader pattern. Whether as queens in France, duchesses in Tuscany, or noble women in Rome, Medici women often found their lives cut short, their bodies riddled with mysterious illnesses, their ends clouded by suspicion. For every birth they endured, whispers circulated of miscarriages and strange fevers. Behind every alliance sealed in marriage, shadows lurked, waiting for the opportunity to turn a banquet into a death sentence. Eleonora's early death, at just 40, marked a turning point. It showed that even the most exalted Medici were not safe within their gilded palaces. Theirs was a dynasty where women carried dynastic burdens not only in childbirth, but in the silent, ever-present fear of poison. In Florence, it was said, to marry into the Medici was to marry into danger. By the late 16th century, the Medici palaces themselves seemed to breathe suspicion. The glittering banquets that once symbolized Florentine splendor had become arenas of invisible warfare. Poison had seeped into the culture of the court, not as myth, but as method, a political tool wielded as readily as treaties and armies. Diplomatic reports from Venetian and Spanish envoys reveal a chilling pattern. Servants, cooks, and cupbearers were not mere household staff but potential assassins. Loyalty was measured not only in words, but in the trust to pour wine or carve meat. Even the most intimate gestures, offering a glass, sharing a toast, were tinged with dread. The weapon of choice was often arsenic, known as the powder of succession. Tasteless, odorless, and slow in its effect, it could mimic natural illness. Victims wasted away with fevers and stomach pains, their decline attributed to fate or infection. Only later would suspicions arise that politics, not providence, had sealed their doom. In the Medici court, such tactics blurred the line between justice and murder. Rivals could be eliminated without public scandal, and alliances reshaped overnight. To poison was to rewrite the script of power silently, leaving no battlefield scars, only whispers and empty thrones. The irony was cruel. These same halls, where artists unveiled masterpieces and philosophers debated human dignity, also hosted the quiet passing of cups laced with death. Under frescoed ceilings painted with divine triumphs, men and women clutched their stomachs, sweating and fading, undone by hands they once trusted. As the stories multiplied, the dynasty's image began to shift. The Medici were no longer seen only as patrons of the Renaissance, but as prisoners of their own fear. Behind the beauty of Florence lay a court where every smile could hide betrayal, and every feast could serve as an execution. The shadow of poison was so pervasive that later generations struggled to separate legend from fact. Was every sudden death truly an assassination, or had paranoia itself become part of the Medici inheritance? What mattered more than truth was perception, and perception declared that the dynasty's greatest enemy was not foreign invaders, but the silent venom coursing through its own veins. Thus, beneath the chandeliers and velvet, the Medici lived not in comfort but in constant vigilance. Their palaces became gilded prisons, where beauty masked danger, and where every sip of wine carried the possibility of finality. Centuries after the Medici had faded from political power, their bones still whispered secrets. In the 20th century, teams of Italian scientists and historians undertook a remarkable project. the exhumation and study of the Medici tombs in Florence's Basilica of San Lorenzo. Their goal was not only to preserve the remains, but also to uncover the truth about the family's mysterious deaths. What they found was startling. Samples of hair, bones, and tissue from figures like Francesco I and Bianca Capello revealed elevated levels of mercury and arsenic. The findings aligned uncannily with the centuries-old rumors that their sudden demise in 1587 was no accident. Scientific data seemed to confirm what Florentines had whispered for generations. Poison coursed through the dynasty's blood. For Francesco and Bianca, the results pointed toward deliberate poisoning rather than malaria. The concentration of toxic substances far exceeded what could have been attributed to medical treatments of the era, where mercury was sometimes prescribed for ailments. Instead, the evidence suggested ingestion of lethal doses, timed too perfectly with the political ambitions of Francesco's brother, Ferdinando, who conveniently ascended to power immediately afterward. The forensic investigations extended beyond this infamous couple. Other Medici remains displayed signs of heavy metal exposure as well. Some could be attributed to the primitive medicine of the 16th century, where cures often inflicted more harm than relief. Yet patterns emerged too consistent to ignore. The family's frequent illnesses, fevers, and mysterious collapses suddenly seemed less like fate and more like design. These modern revelations cast new light on the Renaissance glitter of Florence. Behind the frescoes and marble facades, poison had been as integral to the Medici story as art and architecture. Their tombs, once intended as monuments to grandeur, became silent witnesses testifying to betrayal. The discoveries reignited debates among historians. Were the Medici systematically assassinated, or were they victims of their own misguided medicine? The answer may never be definitive, but one truth became undeniable: the dynasty's legend of poison was not mere folklore. Their very bones carried the proof. In the dim crypts of San Lorenzo, surrounded by candlelight and silence, the Medici continued to tell their story. A dynasty that gave the world Michelangelo and Galileo had also left behind toxic traces in its own remains. A chilling reminder that even centuries cannot erase the sting of poison. By the 17th century, the Medici dynasty was already in decline, and the specter of poison seemed to mirror their faltering grip on power. Each suspicious death, each sudden illness, chipped away at their prestige. The Grand Dukes of Tuscany no longer commanded the respect their ancestors had once inspired. Instead, they were viewed as weakened rulers, prisoners of intrigue within their own palaces. The decline was not solely due to poison, but the constant fear of it eroded their stability. Succession became a dangerous game, where heirs lived in dread of rivals within their own bloodline. Distrust seeped into every corner of the dynasty, weakening their ability to project authority outward. Florence, once a beacon of Renaissance brilliance under Medici rule, began to fade in influence compared to rising powers like France and Spain. Political marriages, once the Medici's greatest weapon, brought little relief. Their queens of France, such as Catherine de' Medici and Marie de' Medici, became infamous for their own reputations with poison and intrigue, cementing the family's sinister image across Europe. The dynasty's identity became inseparable from whispers of betrayal and death by the cup. By the 18th century, the Medici line was running dry. Successive rulers proved ineffectual, lacking both the charisma and cunning of their forebears. While art and science still flourished under their patronage, the family itself seemed hollowed out, a relic of past glory. When Giangaston de' Medici died in 1737 without an heir, the dynasty effectively ended. His sister, Anna Maria Luisa, became the last scion, and though she preserved the family's cultural treasures through the family pact, she could not revive their political power. The dynasty that had once crowned popes and ruled Florence with iron velvet had collapsed under its own weight. Poison may not have killed every Medici, but it symbolized their undoing. It was the perfect metaphor for a family that consumed itself from within, rotting behind gilded walls while presenting a facade of splendor to the world. In the end, the Medici left behind no heirs to continue their name, but they did leave a paradoxical legacy: unparalleled artistic achievements, intertwined with a reputation for secrecy, suspicion, and toxic intrigue. Their fall was as inevitable as it was tragic, the final act in a story where ambition, poison, and betrayal intertwined until nothing remained but echoes in the crypts of Florence. The tragedy of the Medici dynasty rests in its paradox. While they gave life to some of the greatest art the world has ever known, their own bodies decayed under the shadow of poison. In Florence, the Medici palaces stood as monuments to beauty, marble halls, frescoed ceilings, gardens filled with sculptures. Michelangelo sculpted under their patronage, Botticelli painted visions that still ignite wonder, and Galileo found a protector in their court. Yet beneath this dazzling surface, their crypts tell a story of corrosion, betrayal, and toxic decline. Walking through Florence today, one cannot escape the Medici imprint. Their name adorns chapels, their symbols mark palaces, their presence permeates the city's identity. But in the hushed silence beneath San Lorenzo, where their bodies lie, science reveals the darker side of their legacy. Bones infused with arsenic, hair laced with mercury. These chemical fingerprints transform the family's legend from rumor into historical reality. The contrast is almost unbearable. Above ground, eternal art, the glitter of Renaissance triumph, works that continue to breathe life centuries later. Below ground, poisoned remains flesh once regal, now reduced to evidence in a forensic investigation. The Medici seem to embody both the immortality of culture and the fragility of the human body. For Florentines of the 16th century, this contradiction was both terrifying and symbolic. They saw their rulers commissioning churches while simultaneously falling to strange fevers. They witnessed processions celebrating Medici glory, only to attend funerals days later. In art, the family achieved permanence. In life, they were as vulnerable as any peasant sipping tainted water. The dynasty's story reminds us that beauty and decay can coexist. The Medici left paintings that never fade, architecture that never crumbles, ideas that never die. But their own flesh carried poison, as if fate insisted that no dynasty could embody pure triumph. Their art promised eternity, but their corpses whispered mortality. This tension between the eternal and the ephemeral became the Medici's greatest irony. They built a world where human genius seemed capable of conquering time, yet they themselves could not escape the silent enemy in their wine. Florence glowed with light, while their crypts grew heavy with darkness. It is in this paradox, art above, poison below, that the Medici legacy lingers, haunting and sublime. The tale of the Medici's poisoned fate is more than a family chronicle. It is a mirror reflecting the dangers of unchecked ambition. Their dynasty shows how power rarely collapses in a blaze of battlefield glory. More often, it dissolves slowly, silently, like poison slipping into a glass of wine. The Medici believed themselves eternal. They adorned Florence with monuments meant to last for centuries. They crowned popes, forged alliances, and shaped the destiny of nations. And in one sense, they succeeded. Their art remains immortal, their name still echoes. But in another sense, they failed, because they could not conquer the frailty of the human body or the corrosive nature of mistrust. Poison became the perfect symbol of their downfall. Unlike swords or cannons, it did not announce itself with noise. It crept into the bloodstream, invisible, leaving rulers gasping in their chambers, leaving heirs collapsing at banquets. The very secrecy of poison mirrored the secrecy of politics, a reminder that the greatest threats often come not from open enemies but from those seated at the same table. Yet within this tragedy lies something profoundly human. The Medici remind us that even the most powerful families are vulnerable to fear, to betrayal, to the small and silent forces that undo empires. Their poisoned cups were not only instruments of murder but metaphors for the corrosive effect of suspicion itself. A dynasty that trusted no one eventually destroyed itself from within. And still, something survived. Not their bloodline, which ended in the 18th century, but their art, their patronage, their enduring influence on culture and science. The stones of Florence, the canvases of Botticelli, the dome of Brunelleschi, these remain untouchable, immune to the venom that claimed their patrons. This is the final lesson of the Medici, that while power can be poisoned, beauty cannot. Thrones crumble, palaces fade, bodies decay, but art endures. And in that endurance, the Medici found their only true immortality.